record to the cloud. All right, so last time we got together, we were about recording macros. So the whole point was record a macro, take a look, understand what it's created for you, and don't be afraid to modify it. And we had several students who came up to me afterwards or had a question and said, hey, it's not recording when I click on a cell. It's not recording anything. How many of you experienced that? Just a handful here. So it turns out that that is a bug that has been introduced in the most recent version of Excel. So if you're on Excel 365, which I expect most of you are on, you're going to update probably sometime this semester to that version. The good news is we're not going to be recording that much here in class. Most of the assignments we're going to do doesn't require recording, but that's a pretty significant problem to say, yeah, the macro recording, you select a cell, it just doesn't record selecting the cell. And so here's a workaround that will at least let you get through this first project that you do have to record for. And that is, it's a little bit annoying, but instead of just clicking on a cell, if you double click the cell, that'll take you into edit it and then hit escape to not do it. That will record going to the cell. So at least that's what seems to work. So if some of you are here who had that problem before, if you can just kind of verify that for me, that would be outstanding. So yeah, the way Office 365 works is that the idea is they roll out updates and they send them to you straight away, but you're not all getting them at the same moment. So they kind of stagger the updates to different folks. So chances are it's going to hit you sometime this semester. Okay, any questions on that issue? I'm always a little troubled whenever Microsoft makes a change that affects things because it's really hard to search for. But I got back to my office, I Googled it, and immediately I saw people talking about it. They just posted like 3 or 4 hours earlier in the day. So I'm sure that Microsoft knows about the issue by now. It's kind of a big issue, hoping they'll fix it pretty quickly. Okay, let's take a look at what we got going on next week. So next week is, I better get the right screen up. Next week is Martin Luther King Jr. Day on Monday, so we won't have class then. And because they're already got 1 day off that week, that's the day that the MBA program schedules for business trips. It's like they take their students off campus and they actually cut class to go and do stuff. So when we very first started teaching this class here, we thought, we should teach it under an MBA number to kind of communicate to MBA students. This is meant for you. This is a class designed for MBA students. We also needed to cross-list it as a 500 level class, because we wanted undergraduate students to be able to take it as well. You can't, so some of you are actually registered for MBA 614, that's this class, others for IS 520. The truth is, that was like in 2007 that we first taught it. The truth is, the MBAs now know, regardless of what we called this class, they would still come and take the class if they wanted the content. But because that class is still kind of co-listed as an MBA class, we just kind of dismiss class. It's a requirement of an MBA class not to hold class on that day. So normally I would just dismiss class altogether. However, on the very last day of class, I'm going to be introducing something new that we have not ever covered in this class before. So this class is about automating Excel, automating spreadsheets. And Microsoft, not all that long ago, introduced a new way to do it that's not VBA. So historically, the only thing I've ever taught in this class is VBA. But it's now possible to automate Excel with JavaScript. So if you're coming from a programming background, you say, I already know JavaScript, this would be something that'll really be interesting to you. So that's what I'm going to do on the last day of class. And I thought, well, if there are some folks kind of here at the beginning of the semester, it's not that much, probably not that stressed out yet. So you can essentially shift this day of instruction up to next Wednesday. So I'm going to cover that same content on the last day of class, and I'm going to cover it on Wednesday as well. So if you're here in town, you think, yeah, I'd like to go ahead and attend that class, come and attend it. You'll get that content, and then you can have like one less day to attend at the end of the semester. So I will show you kind of what it takes to automate Excel with JavaScript. It is not the right language to begin with, so as beginning environment, and it's not nearly as powerful You can't do as nearly as many powerful things with JavaScript as you can with VBA. So this class is probably going to continue to be a VBA class, at least as the rest of the time that I teach it. But there's a new interesting kind of way to do things. So we'll talk about that next Wednesday class, but that'll be optional. You can attend that content on the last day of class. Questions? How many of you are just kind of curious? This will be the first time I've taught it. How many of you are going, whoa, that sounds really interesting, automate with JavaScript? Now, some of you, I'm guessing that you already know JavaScript to some degree if you're interested in it. Okay, but today's content is working with Excel's built-in objects and collections. So we have a workbook to download. So go ahead and kind of go to the blog for the course and download the air traffic passenger statistics if you want to follow along. It's always fine just to sit back and watch. You don't have to follow along, but that's where we'll be. And so that's what this file is. It just has some statistics. I think it's from San Francisco International Airport, information about different flights in and out of it. And we've aggregated that across the years that this file reports and made some charts about it. But we have talked about objects already. So someone just tell me, an object is a thing. Object's a thing, anything that we're going to be able to manipulate with code in VBA. Objects have two characteristics that are really important to us. Someone just shout out what's one of those characteristics that we're interested in of objects. Objects have methods. A method is something the object knows how to do. And objects have properties. Properties is like, now that we know about variables, a property is really like a variable that's built into the object. It's just something that holds value, that tells me something about the way the object is. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at today is working with some of the main built-in objects and collections of objects that we're going to be manipulating. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a code editor. Even though this is an XLSM workbook, there's no macros, there's not even a module in this workbook yet. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a module. So in my Visual Basic Editor, just a reminder, what's the keystroke to get to the Visual Basic Editor really quick is just Alt F11, and that works in Mac and PC. So either one should open this up. If you're not, anyway, we just want to go ahead and choose Insert Module. That will give us a module to do our examples in today. Oh, we're going to make a couple of changes while we're here, just to make your environment a little bit easier to work with. So I am going to do two things. First, I'm going to delete this module out. Remove module. Do I want to export it? No. It won't hurt if you leave that one there, but I want you to be able to see what the effect that we're about to have. So there's a couple of changes you want to make in your environment. So I'm going to come here to Tools, and I'm going to choose Options. We're going to change a couple of options, just about how the Visual Basic Editor is configured. And the first two choices here, we're going to reverse. So here in the code settings, I'm going to turn off auto syntax check. This really won't turn it off. It'll still be doing the auto syntax check for us. But if it finds a syntax error, if it finds some error in our code that it can't understand, it will just make that line red. It won't display up a message box. So that message box can get pretty annoying. If you're typing along, you're halfway through a statement, you leave the line, it puts up a message box. So you probably want to turn off auto syntax check. Again, it'll still show you your errors in red. And then we also want to turn on require variable declaration. And I'll say OK, making those two changes. And now I'm going to insert a module again. So when you say require variable declaration, then when you create a new module, it automatically puts this statement at the top. You can type this in if it's not there, and it works just fine if you don't have it there. But we've talked about, not too long ago, I think a week ago, we talked about declaring variables. And when we say require, when we say option explicit, means we have to explicitly declare our variables. That is going to make it so that we have to use a variable before we declare it. Let's just take a little detour into variables here for just a minute today. So let's call this sub object1, obj1. Okay, so I'm going to take off this option explicit here for just a second, make it into a comment. And I'm going to come in here and just say x equals 5, debug. print X. Okay, so that should print 5 into our immediate window. Now, the interesting thing here is I never declared X. When we work with variables, say, oh, you have a dim statement that says what type of variable it's going to be, and that type will let us know how much memory gets allocated and so forth. So you have to remember that the philosophy of the language VBA is such that they said, listen, if our user has forgotten to do something or hasn't done something quite right, we want to try to guess what they meant, and in some cases, just kind of do that for them. And that's what's happening here with this variable declaration. I did not declare a variable. And so the interpreter, I didn't declare variable X. I just started using it. The interpreter comes along and it sees the sub and it goes, sub, yeah, I get it. This is a sub procedure. Great. It looks at the next part here and goes, okay, that's the name of the sub procedure. If something else refers to obj1, that's going to be talking about this sub procedure. Great. It looks at these parentheses and says, okay, there's not going to be any parameters passed here, but if they were, they'd be inside the parentheses. And it gets to that X right there. And it goes, X? What's X? And it thinks, is it another sub procedure somewhere or another function procedure? We haven't talked about those. It says, is it an object that I have available to me here in Excel? And it kind of looks through all of its objects and goes, no, it's no object. Could it be a reserved word? It's not a reserved word. Could it be, I don't know what else I might think of, but it kind of goes through everything that it could possibly be, and it goes, it's none of that stuff. The only thing this could possibly be is a variable, but the user has not declared this variable. And so it essentially says, okay, we're going to believe it's a variable, and we're going to declare it for the user, even though there's no statement. So this is the first time we've seen this variable. We're going to have to allocate some memory for it, and then we'll use it. And so it does that without us having to say. Most languages, if you try to use a variable before you declare it, it'll say, this is an undeclared variable. You can't do that. You want to use that variable, declare it, so we can allocate some memory and you can be ready to use it. Not VBA. VBA says, okay, we'll declare it in the background. Now, we talked about, most of the variables we talked about a week ago were fixed length variables. When you declare the variable, like when you declare an integer, a variable of type int, does anyone just happen to remember how much memory? I wouldn't expect you to know this, but does anyone happen to remember how much memory gets allocated when I declare a variable of type int? The range is going to be plus or minus 32,000. Good, but how much memory does it take? How many bytes of memory? Yeah, it's a 2-byte variable. So when I declare that, I am telling the VBA interpreter, I'm going to need 2 bytes of memory. I'm going to be storing some number that's going to be in the range between plus or minus 32,000. So that's all the memory I need. Now, I haven't declared this variable. Excel, the VBA interpreter sees the variable and says, oh, a variable. I have no idea. I have no idea what the user is going to do with this. It's not smart enough to figure out what I might be typing in somewhere. And so it says, I better make this the most flexible data type possible. And it's actually a new data type we did not talk about last time. So there is another variable type called variant. Let's just take a little detour into variant for a minute. So if I had declared this the way it's going to be declared by default, I would do it like this, dim x as variant. Now, you probably remember the string data type. It's a variable length data type, so how much memory gets used for that variable depends on what I put in it. There are 4 bytes of overhead for a string that says how long the string is, and then 1 byte per character that I'm going to store. Variant is also a variable length data type. So how much gets used depends on what I'm trying to store, and it can be anything. So variant is basically, listen, you want to put a number in here? Great. You treat it like a number, it'll be a number. You want to put a string in here? Super fantastic. You put a string in, we'll treat it like a string. You want it to be an object? We'll talk more about object variables today. We introduced those a week ago. We'll treat it like an object. You want to be, basically says, we'll do anything. The cost to that, string has 4 bytes of overhead. Variant has 22 bytes of overhead. There's a lot of overhead with this, but it could do anything. And that's the type that if I don't declare the variable, that's the kind that it gets declared as. So X is going to be of type variant if I don't declare it. Oh, boy, you might say, wow, maybe we should just declare everything as variant, and you don't want to do that. It's not because you're using up too much memory. I mean, you've got scads of memory. So using an extra 22 bytes on your variables is not a big deal. The thing is that when you're using the variant type, Excel has the VBA interpreter has a very long set of rules that it uses to decide what type it's actually going to behave as. And you do not know what those rules are. So you definitely want to say, I'm going to be using this as a string, declare it as a string. It's going to be a floating point number, declare it as single, or declare it as double. You don't want, I almost want to say that it's going to guess at it, but it's not going to guess. There's a set of rules, but you don't know what it's going to be. So the point is, without option explicit here, then I can just use this variable and it'll work. I'll run that and it prints my 5 up there. But if I have option explicit turned on here, it says, listen, I need to explicitly declare my variables. And if I forget to declare one, interpreter, you tell me that I haven't done that. So now with this directive at the top, this is a line at the top that kind of tells the interpreter how to behave. It's not actually doing something except saying, all right, when you go to do this, behave in a certain way. I'm going to go ahead and run this. And now when I run it, it's going to tell me, wait a minute, you're using a variable before you've defined it. And so because we checked that box over here in tools, tools options, because we said require variable declaration, it's automatically going to put this statement in for us. And this is the one that actually says, don't let me use variables without declaring them. So this was going to help you make sure you have your variables declared, because you don't want them being type variant unless you're absolutely sure that's what you want to do. In which case you would declare it like this, dimx as variant, and then that would work just fine. But the more important reason why you want to have option explicit on is because it really then turns on like a spell checker for your variable names. Because one of the hardest things to find is a misspelled variable name, especially if you have long variable names, which I encourage you to do, just these long descriptive variable names. If you're like me, 2 letters transposed side by side is a tough thing for me to see as a problem. And so if I have option explicit on and I've transposed a variable name where I'm using it, all of a sudden we'll say, hey, you haven't declared that variable. It's like spell checking my variable names for me. And that is really good because you can spend a long time looking for a misspelled variable. If that variable is allowed to, or if you let the VBA interpreter actually declare that variable, go, oh, you've never declared this variable, we'll declare it for you now. No. I meant that to be spelled differently. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so that's what option explicit is. All right, so let's talk about then some of the built-in collections of objects that are here already. So the first one is called Workbooks. So Workbooks is a collection of all the workbooks that are open in this instance of Excel. Not all the workbooks that have been made on this computer, the ones that are open right now. And so I've got just the one workbook open here. Is that right? Oh, you can't see me alt tabbing over here, but there really is just one workbook open here. And so I should be able to come here and say debug.print workbooks.count. Okay. So it turns out we have lots, anytime we've got several objects that we want to treat uniformly, there may already be a collection built for us. And so we're saying, listen, there could be several workbooks open. Those workbooks are all kind of aggregated in another object that's called a collection. And so workbooks is itself an object. The workbooks object is not a workbook, it is a collection. And all a collection does, it's an object that holds references to other objects. So collections always have a count property. Because what a collection object does is, I'm keeping track of a bunch of objects for you. I can always ask it, how many objects are there? And so by asking for the count or saying, I want to print debug.print workbooks.count, that'll tell me how many workbooks are currently open. I'm expecting this to say 1. And that's good. But even if you only have one workbook open, or at least you only see one workbook open, if you run it, it may show you that you have 2, or it may say you have 1 more than you really think you have. Did that happen for anyone when you ran this? Yeah, so you have just one open and it says 2. So what that means is you probably at some point recorded a macro and put it into your personal macro workbook. And because that is a workbook that opens automatically when you open Excel. If that's the case, when you look over here in your Project Explorer, you're going to see the project that we're working on, plus you'll see another one called personal.xlsb. And that's there, it's just hidden, so you can't see it, but it's open as well. So even if it's one the user can't see, it'll still show up in the count. All right. So now let's look at how we add a new workbook into this. So the workbooks, this is also pretty common of collections, is that they'll have some way, workbooks, they'll have some way to add a new one in. It's often called add. We'll say workbooks.add, and then I will just print again. So this should now print 2 numbers. Oh no, go back. It's not quite how I wanted you to be. I'm in trouble. Whew, there we go. Oh no. Is there a way to stop and go back? All right, so I've got these 2 over here. I'm going to put my Project Explorer upper left-hand corner. Put my properties over here. Oh, no. That's close enough. Actually, kind of nice that I can set those independently. I've never seen that. I've never had them docked quite that way before, but that's going to be okay. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and run this again, and it should show me that I've got printed the 1. It then added a new workbook and then showed me the count 2. So I added a brand new workbook, and here it is. It hasn't been saved yet, but it's just here. But now my collection tells me I've got 2 workbooks in it. I can refer to objects in a collection always by their ordinal position. And so I have 2 of them in here. The first one that was open is going to be the first one. So if I was to say, I want to print workbooks sub 1 dot name, this is going to be the first one in the collection. So this should start off now. I've got 2 open now, so it should print 2, add another one, print 3, and then print the name of my first open workbook, which is like the air traffic passenger statistics workbook. So let me go ahead and just run that. Let's see what it does. Oh, debug.print. So printed the 2, printed the 3, and then printed that name. Incidentally, if your objects in your collection have names, you can usually refer to them by their name as well. Seems a little bit strange to say I want to refer to the workbook named this and then have it tell me what its name is. So instead of name, why don't I say path? So the path will tell me where that's located on the disk. This is another property of a workbook. And so my workbooks collection is going to allow me to specify which one I'm talking about. I can identify a workbook in that collection. This then will be a reference to a particular workbook. So I can, on that expression, I can call any of the methods or properties that pertain to an individual workbook. So I now should get 3, 4, and then the path to where that file is located. So it happens to be C:users gln2 downloads. That's where it is. How we doing, folks? Just show me on a scale of 0 to 5. We're coming right along here. Good, feeling comfortable. Okay, now as it turns out, let's look at how we might close a workbook. So, or I'm actually going to delete the workbook. So I'm going to say, how am I going to refer to that most recently opened workbook? A couple ways that I could do it. You may notice that when you add a workbook, it becomes the active workbook. So, and there's a way to refer just to whichever workbook is active by saying active workbook. So I can say active workbook dot close. And you'll notice that this method now takes a parameter. Right here, it gives me a little options I can see here. Do you want to save the changes? I'm going to say false here. So now I'm going to print off the count. I'm going to add a worksheet that will become the active worksheet. I'll print off a couple more things. And then I'm going to close the active worksheet without saving the changes, without prompting the user. If you want to save the changes, just close it. If there were changes, what's going to happen to those changes? Gone, gone, gone. They are gone. And then why don't we go ahead and print the count again after this? So it should, be 4, then 5, then 4 for me. A little bit different for you, depending on how many times you've run it. Okay, questions? Let's see, what else we need to know about workbooks? Probably how to save a workbook. So maybe before we close it, and let's look for a different way to refer to that worksheet. Suppose I want to refer to the most recently opened workbook without, even though it may not be the active workbook anymore. Workbooks, and then in parentheses, I can put some number here. So if it's the fourth book that was open, I'd put number 4 here. It's the 5th, I'd put number 5 here. But what expression could I put in there that would just evaluate to the number of workbooks there are? It's one of the neat things here. It doesn't have to be an integer. I can put any expression that will evaluate to the number I want it to be, right? So what I'm saying is I could come in here and I could put 2 plus 2. That would be okay. 2 plus 2. So it would say, 2 plus 2, that makes 4. This is exactly the same as putting a 4 there. So what expression might I put in there to save the most recently opened workbook? Yeah, go ahead. That's exactly right. Workbooks.count. The idea here is that this is going to tell me how many there are. And so if inside these parentheses, I say workbook, which number do you want? I want however many there are. So if there are 5, this will be 5. If there are 12, this will be 12. That will refer to the most recently opened workbook. And then I can say save. Maybe I'll do save as. And then I'll give it, maybe I'll specify a full path out. So I'll put it in my downloads folder. Call it wb2.xlsx. So now we're going to add it. Workbooks, WORKBOOKS. That one dot save as. It's because if I have debugger printed here, that's the problem. Thank you. It's just workbooks.count. Thank you. So that will then, it'll save it as wb2.xlsx. It'll close it without saving the changes, but whatever changes might have been there, we would have saved just there before anyway. So I'll go ahead and run that, and we should and see it. So it closed it, but that should have saved it. See if I can figure out how to easily bring that list up. My computer. There we go. So there's where it saved the wb2.xlsx workbook. So the vast majority of the examples that we do in this class is going to be dealing with a single workbook that we'll be writing code that operates on the workbook that holds the code. But we can manipulate this set of workbooks. There'll be one project where you're going to open up dozens, literally dozens of workbooks as your code is running. There's a question here. Okay, so yeah, so this is a little bit of strange syntax. What's going on here? So workbooks is an object, right? It's a thing that has methods and properties that allows us to do whatever this thing is designed to do. Collections allow me to say in parentheses which one I'm talking about. Now, technically, there's a property here called items. And so I can say workbooks.items and then give it a number. That'll tell me which one I'm talking about. So items is a method, but for whatever reason, they allow us, the language allows us to kind of skip that. It's like if I don't put items in here, it assumes that's what I mean. Let me just make sure that that's true. So I may need a little more practice with how to deal with the items property. So, but the point is that the object itself allows us to tell it which one we're talking about. And then that whole expression up to here now evaluates to a particular workbook. The same way that active workbook is an expression that evaluates to a particular workbook, whichever one happens to be active. This expression identifies a particular workbook, the one that happens to have been opened most recently. And so once I've identified that object, I can then say, dot save as, and that's calling a method of the workbook object, even though what I'm seeing here is a reference to the workbook class, giving it a number, then evaluates to a particular workbook. So I could have some long expression that identifies a particular object, and then once I've figured out that object, I can just put dot whatever method would apply to that object, and that would be okay. Does that answer the question for you? Okay. It's a pretty common thing to be able to say, I want to open up a workbook and then make sure I know which workbook I've just opened. So instead of creating a new one, why don't I go ahead and open up this one that I've just saved? So maybe it's time to make a new example. Make a new subprocedure called obj2. And this time I'm going to say workbooks instead of adding a brand new element into this one. I'm going to bring another object into the collection of workbooks, but I'll do it by opening an existing sheet rather than creating a brand new one. So workbooks.open, and then I'll put the path to a particular. I'll put the path to a particular file. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run only one line. I'll run that and we'll see that it reopens that workbook. Could not find. Maybe I never actually saved it as 22. I know I saved it as WB2 because we went and looked at it. Okay, so we can see that it has opened up that. It's opened up that workbook. Now, that's going to be the active workbook. And so if I got to do a bunch of things to that workbook once I open it, from here on, I can just say active workbook dot whatever, but active workbook is pretty fragile. If the user clicks somewhere else, they could change which workbook is active. And so it's really pretty dangerous just to say, I know that that's going to be the active one that's open, and then assume that's the one that's going to stay active. So it'd be better if I could figure out a way to refer to this one specifically. Now, one way, we saw that we could refer to them by their name. So once this is open, I could close it by saying workbooks and then in parentheses refer to its name. And we won't save the changes. I'm going to go ahead and close this so that it is in good shape to open it again. And so now we should see it happen. We're going to open the workbook and then it's going to workbooks. The false here just says don't save the changes. Seems like that really should refer to. Let me try just the name without the path. Maybe it's the name, maybe the name without the path. Yeah, no path involved, just the name. So that has then closed that particular workbook. So at least this way, I would know exactly which one I'm talking about. But there's a better way to do it. And so instead of referring to by name, we're going to use an object variable. Now, we introduced object variables a week ago. Right? We talked about some numeric types and string types, and we talked about one called object. An object variable only allocates enough memory to hold a memory location, to hold a memory address. So it says I'm going to need some memory here, however much it takes to hold a memory address. So How much it allocates depends on if you're on a 32-bit operating system or a 64-bit operating system, but it's going to allocate the right amount. And so what I'd like to do is I would like to say, listen, when I open this workbook, that workbook is going to get loaded into memory beginning at some location in memory. I want to remember where it is. And as it turns out, when I call open, in addition to opening the workbook, it's going to report back to me where it got loaded into memory. So it's in memory somewhere, and it can tell me where. Now, I don't really care what the address is, because it'll be different every time I run it. But I want to capture that. And so that's what I'm going to use an object variable for. So I'm going to dim WB as, start off by calling it an object. We'll adjust this in a minute. And now I'm going to say set WB equal to workbooks.open, and then specify the workbook I want to open. Oh boy, when they made this language back in 1995, it was pretty cutting edge stuff. But they were making like thousands of decisions about what they should do with this language. It's like a new language. I think most of the decisions they made pretty good choices on. I'm about to show you one where they really made a bad choice with this language. In fact, current versions of Visual Basic, they have fixed this. They have fixed this mistake they made in the language. And that is, sometimes you put parentheses around the argument list when you're calling a method, and sometimes you don't. And understanding the difference is kind of one of the real challenges when you're beginning with programming. In most programming languages today, whenever you have arguments that go to like a function or a procedure or something, you always put them in parentheses. In Visual Basic, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And here's the distinction. A method, like a function, a sub-procedure, a method, some block of code that's going to do something, in many cases, that block of code just goes and does something. And when it's over, it's done. But in many cases, when that block of code is done running, it sends some information back that you might be expecting to come back. For instance, when we put up, I'll show you how to do this later in class, but we can put up a little dialog box that says, you want to continue, put a yes and a no button. And when you click on that, one of those buttons, it'll send back some information to tell us which button they clicked on. That would be good. I may not care. Maybe all it has is an OK button, and I'm not going to do something different depending on what they click, so I don't really care. The distinction about when I put parentheses around the argument list is if I'm going to do something with the value that comes back from that call. If I'm going to do something with the value that comes back, I put parentheses around the argument list. If I'm not going to do anything with the value that comes back, I do not put parentheses around the argument list. So in this case, before I put this on the front of it, I'm not doing anything I'm not doing anything with the value that comes back from the function or from this method. And so there are no parentheses around the argument that I'm passing to it. But as soon as I say I want to capture the address that comes back, I now have to put parentheses around. Your life would be so much easier if it was you always put parentheses. But that's just the language that we have to live with. So the question is, so if you put parentheses when you shouldn't have them, you'll get an error, and the answer is maybe. Yeah, is that terrible? Here, let me come back up to this one. So Workbooks, no, I guess I'm gonna have to do it right here. I'm gonna kind of go back to this one. We're gonna open and close the same one, not really worrying about this object variable yet. I'm going to leave these parentheses around it, and this is going to execute just fine. In fact, maybe I should show this on something that's a little bit simpler. Sub message box. Call this message box demo. All right, so I can just say MSG BOX, and just put a message, hello world. And if I run that, it should display up the message box that says that text in it. Now, this is going to send back a value depending on which button I click. There's only one button there, so it's going to send back a value saying, hey, you clicked on the OK button. But I'm not doing anything with it, so I don't need the parentheses. Let me go ahead and do something else I could put here. I could change the buttons. I could say VB, yes, no. So this is, I'm giving it an argument here, telling it to do something, and that will be which buttons should be on there. So now if I run it, I've got the yes and the no button. Either one I click on, it just closes and moves on. But now I could say I want to, let's dim response as an integer and say response equals that. Now it says, hey, this syntax is no good. What do I have to do? What's the problem? Because I'm doing something with the value that comes back, I've got to put parentheses around here. Okay, so that's good. It showed me an error. At least it didn't let it go without it. So now I should be able to print that response. debug dot print. I'm going to get right behind my keyboard. All right. So now when I run this, let me bring my window a little smaller here. Now when I run this, if I click yes, it's going to print 6. If I click no, it's going to print 7. So those happen to be the numbers that come back for yes and no. There's lots of different buttons. OK is a different value. Cancel is a different value. There's even one called abort. It's a different value. So it doesn't really matter which set it's on. The name of the button is going to tell you which value it comes back. OK, so now let's say I don't really care about putting the button on. So I'm going to back this out. And that should work just fine. But my only choice is going to be OK. So that's number 1. Now let me go ahead and take this off. I'm not going to even print it. So now it would be great, in my opinion, if this would give an error saying, hey, you got the parentheses there, they don't belong. But this is going to work OK. And I'll explain to you why it works OK. Let's suppose I'm going to print a number up here instead. I'm going to print, I'll print 5 plus 3 times 2. Do the addition first, and then do the multiplication. That should give me 16. These parentheses kind of play double duty here. So those parentheses, oh, those aren't the parentheses that go around an argument list. Those are the parentheses that go to do a mathematical expression to control order of operations. And so the truth is, if I want to do order of operations with strings as well, that's OK. And so it looks at those parentheses and says, you know what, you're just giving me, that's just a single argument. That's not an argument in a list. That's just a single argument. So that's why those parentheses don't cause a problem. But if I were to put something here that said, put on the VB yes, no button, yes, no button, VB yes, no, that's going to fail. Because now the only thing that can be is, oh, those are parentheses around an argument list, and you're not doing anything with the value that comes back. Is this complex? This is so totally complex. How I wish this is not something you had to deal with. You're just beginning with this language. So, yeah, and of course I could say, rest equals, and I'd be OK again. RESP. So the rule that you want to say is, listen, if I'm doing something with the value that comes back, parentheses go on. If I'm not, then the parentheses don't belong there. If you're only giving it a single argument, the parentheses could go or not go. I mean, the parentheses, it's OK. All right. So now let's kind of come back to where we are on this prior example. So what I'm going to do is, because workbooks.open is going to send a value back, I'm going to catch that value by saying set WB equal to workbooks.open. So now WB will become another way to refer to that particular workbook. We've seen different ways to refer to workbooks. We can refer to it by saying the workbooks collection, and then in parentheses, put a number. That will refer to a particular one. I can say active workbook. That would refer to one. Here's another one right here. Watch this. This workbook. This workbook refers to the workbook that has the code that we're currently executing. I don't care which one's active. I don't care when it was opened. It's the one that is holding the code we're executing. That would be that particular workbook. Another way to refer to this workbook now is with this variable WB. WB after this will evaluate to that particular workbook that was just opened. It doesn't matter if more are opened or some that were opened before this one closed, it's going to refer to that particular workbook, which means I can now close it by referring to its name. So this object variable says, hey, I want to capture the address where this workbook got opened in memory. And that will be the way that I can refer to that location in memory where the workbook is, until the end of the sub procedure. So now that should open it and close it just fine. The nice thing about this is it doesn't matter what it's named. If the user changes the name, it doesn't matter. It's referring to that particular workbook. Now, the use of this keyword set is a little bit troubling. Why isn't it just WB equals? Yeah, somebody's saying, yeah, I was wondering that myself. Why is it? Why is that? Well, it turns out in the very early days of BASIC, let's take a look at a statement like this. I am going to, after I capture resp here, I'm going to say resp equals what it used to be plus 1. Looking at that statement by itself should be, in one sense, it could be really troubling. Because if that statement ever true, does resp ever equal resp plus 1? Do we have mathematicians here? There's a special case when resp equals resp plus 1. What is that? When resp is, maybe equals is the wrong word for that. When resp is infinity. Yeah, if resp is infinity, you add 1 to it, it's still infinity. Like that's the strange thing. But this is not a statement of equality, right? This is not, some statement that I'm trying to figure out if it's true or false. This is an assignment. This says, take what's on the right-hand side and put it on the left-hand side. It just happens to look like a mathematical equation, which would be a really weird equation. And so in the very early days of the language, you could say this, let resp equal resp plus 1. Now, all of a sudden, that turns that almost into an English language sentence. We don't normally talk like this. Who talks this way, by the way? God is the one who talks this way. Let resp equal resp plus 1. Like, let there be light. And God spoke it and it happened. It was actually kind of like writing let into my code because it feels very authoritative to do it. And so that's the way that we assign normal variables. But to assign object variables, they said, no, we're going to use a different word, set. And the reason is, if I were to declare this as a variant, that's okay. I can declare an object as something I'm going to treat like an object as a variant. Now that variant is going to be a little bit kind of unsure what to do. And so by saying let or set, it says either I'm going to refer to the memory address that's coming back, or I'm going to refer to a particular property of the object. Do you want to actually see the collision? Do you want to see the one that made them come up with these different words for the language? It doesn't take that long to do. I don't know if that's really helpful to learn it, but let me show it to you. We can do this with a range. It really isn't what I wanted to talk about here today, but we're almost done. Sub RNG1 range demo. Let me dim R as variant. And then I'm going to want to say R equals active cell. Okay. If I want this to behave like an object variable, let me put the keyword set in here. So that's going to bind R onto the active cell. So I should be able to say, print the address of R. Right now I'm on H14. When I run this, it should print H14. But as it turns out, remember that the philosophy behind the language is if you forgot to do something, if you forgot to put something here, we're going to guess at what you mean. And so if I was just to say print active cell, let me like put a number in here. If I was just to say print active cell, does that even make sense to print the active cell? Active cell is an object. How many properties does a range object have? Dozens. Which one should I print? Or should I print the whole object? Should I print them all? What do you think the user means? If we have a user who writes this, what do you think the user means? If you wrote that, what might you mean? I want the value. And that's exactly what it will do. Many objects have what's referred to as a default property. If I refer to the object without specifying the property, it goes, oh, you must mean value. You must mean the value property. It's a default, right? Here's again, VBA guessing at what you meant because you didn't really say anything that made any sense here. You print the whole object. You want to print the methods too? Or is it just the properties? What do you want? It's not clear. And so because there's a notion of a default property without the keyword set here, what does this mean? Does this mean bind this variable onto this object? Or does it mean put the value 22 into R? Let me print the type name. I think it's called type name of R. That'll tell me what data type it is. So it bound onto it, and it's treating it like a number, double precision floating point number. Why double precision instead of integer or something, or byte? It's variant, and so it's not quite sure what I'm going to want to do with it, and that's its best guess. So that's the type it's going to use for that. So it's actually not using the address, it's not using the object, it's binding onto the default property. So here, if I was to say set, now it should tell me that it's a range. So the whole point here is that without telling it either let or set, it doesn't know if I mean the address of this object or the default property of this object. That's the ambiguity that we're solving by saying, when we're saying, hey, when we're binding a variable onto an object, you have to use the keyword set. I think the idea, the philosophy is this, is that, look, if you are getting advanced enough to bind an object variable onto an object, you're ready to deal with having to use a different keyword here for set. So again, they're writing this so that it will work for Edna in accounting, who's got her little VBA for Dummies book, and she's trying to follow along to make something happen automatically. And she's not really grasping the whole thing. You are like highly educated university students, and we're going through this. So that's the idea. Questions? Okay, yeah, go ahead. It's only returning what? So you mean you have it set up just like this? And you're printing R? Oh, so you had something, you were printing something different than you thought you were printing? Okay, excellent. Okay. We spent a lot of time on worksheet. We spent way too long on the worksheet object. Let's go to a different collection. So we've got another collection here. Oh, let me do one more thing here. Instead of variant, right? What I really mean here is object, but instead of object, what I really mean here is range. If I give it not just an object, but a type of object, now two things happen here. One is the only kind of object that R is allowed to bind onto is going to be a range object. If I try to bind it onto a worksheet, it's going to say it's the wrong kind of object. But the real reason to do this is so now that when you're programming, the editor here knows that R is a range. So when you hit R dot, it will give you the properties and methods that you can use from there. So that by putting an actual kind of object here instead of the generic class object, it will help you with the IntelliSense, right? It'll come in here and say, this is a range. So here are the things you do with a range. So that's, to me, that's the real reason to put a specific type here. So you can get a little help while you're programming. Okay, we can add worksheets as well. Worksheet demo. So worksheet demo. Okay, so I'm going to say this workbook. This workbook refers to the workbook that has the code in it. So that's going to be passenger statistics W22 in my case, because I've saved it, for this term. Dot worksheets. So this now is going to be the collection of all the worksheets, not all the worksheets that are open in Excel right now, because I've got a different worksheets collection in each workbook. I'll pick a particular workbook, and now I'm referring to all the worksheets that are in this workbook. There's how many? I think there's only 2. Well, let's just find out. Let's print. And this worksheets is a collection. So how do I ask it how many there are? Dot count. That should tell me how many worksheets I have in this workbook, and there's 2. One with the data and then one with the charts on it. So I'm getting those 2 here. But this is going to get me to that collection. And I can add a collection. I can add one here as well. Dot add. And that, let me go ahead and make that the active one so we can see it happen. So now that should not add a new workbook, should add a new worksheet into that workbook. So now I've got sheet 1 here that came into this workbook. Something similar here. If I'm going to have to want to do something with this worksheet, let me dim WS as a worksheet. And now I can set WS equal to worksheets.add. I'm not giving it any arguments at all, so I don't need the parentheses in this case either way, because there's nothing to send after it. And then I should be able to close that worksheet. ws.delete should delete that worksheet. An interesting thing is going to happen here that's a little bit unfortunate in my opinion. So that should add a worksheet, and then it should try to delete it. And I get this error. Well, it's not an error message, it's a warning. Microsoft Excel will permanently delete this sheet. Do you want to continue? Do you recognize that message from anywhere? Yeah, every time you delete a sheet by hand, this pops up. The very fact that I'm deleting this worksheet through code makes me think, you know what? I don't think you should be asking. I wrote code to delete that. I'm pretty sure I wanted to delete it. But it doesn't, it still prompts, and that's a problem. Can you imagine if you're trying to delete the worksheet and you really want it to delete and the user goes, well, I don't know, I guess I don't really want to delete it, and they cancel it? But the worksheet didn't get deleted. What if you're counting on that being deleted? Well, it turns out that's another built-in object. So one of the other objects that I can work with is the application object itself. It refers to all of Excel. Application, it has properties and methods. Right, the dot here, and activate Microsoft auth app. I have no idea what that method does, but that's the very first method that we have here. And you can kind of tell the difference between methods and properties, because if you look at this icon, it's kind of hard to see. I know it's small. Let me think I can zoom in. If we look at that icon, what is it? What is that icon? Any idea? Who makes this stuff? What is it? Take a guess. What do you think it is? It's a flying something. Yeah, this is it's a thing. This is an object in motion. It's an object doing something. That's a method. What is this one? It's like a list with a finger pointing at one of them. That really is like pointing at this list of properties. What you're seeing there is you're seeing oh, there's not many properties here. But if you have a more complex object, there's lots of properties. It only has a name. There'd be lots of properties here. It's pointing at one of those. It's like they made these icons in the 1990s. We just come out of the 80s. We were still reeling from all the big hair and the shoulder pads. And that's what they came up with. Anyway, application dot, and there's a property called display alerts. It's a Boolean property, true or false. I'm just going to set it equal to false. Remember, a property tells me about something about the way the object is. And so now this object, my whole Excel, is going to behave differently with respect to should it display alerts. Because I've turned off the display alerts, it's me saying, hey, listen, Mr. VBA interpreter, I know what I'm doing here. If I do something that you want to put a prompt up, no, just accept the default. I'm doing it. So now when I run that, it should, I don't know if you'll see it, it'll happen pretty quickly. Create the sheet and then delete it. Let me just go ahead and put a stop in here. Stop just tells the code to pause. It doesn't like actually stop it from running. It just pauses. So there's sheet 4. We can see the sheet 4 is there created. If I hit play to continue running again, we should see it go away. So stop can be really helpful while you're debugging. Say, hey, give me right here and just kind of pause. Okay. So I'm going to show you something else that's going to seem a little bit strange. This expression here evaluates to, and after it adds the sheet, what does it do? It sends back the address where in memory where it was created. That's why I can capture that and then use that to refer to that particular worksheet. But watch this. Let me copy this line. And let me just comment out these. Instead of setting this equal to something, this expression itself refers to the object that was just created. If I only want to change one property of that, I can use this expression as the reference to it. This is like, what's going on here? Maybe I'm making an invoice. Up here, this is referring to a particular workbook, the worksheets collection on that, and I'm calling the add method on that. That add method adds a worksheet and returns the reference to that worksheet that was just created. I can actually call another name, another property on that and change a property of that worksheet that was just created. Whoa. Workbook.worksheets.add.name equals invoice. That should add a worksheet and name it invoice. The message here is that anytime you're referring to an object, if you've got a reference to an object, you can say dot property and refer to a property, or dot method and refer to the method of that of that particular object. Okay, so similar to capturing a workbook that was open, we can say we want to refer to that worksheet, and of course I could do other things to this. Before I delete it, I could say ws.name equals. Let me just set it to invoice. This is going to be a problem. Why will this be a problem to set it to invoice like this? Yeah, this is going to fail because I'm going to try to set it's going to make the new sheet okay. And then I am going to try to set it to invoice, and that's going to cause an error. Now, that's not just an alert. That is an error. I'm not allowed to do that. So my little display alerts false here is not going to suppress that kind of message. There's created sheet number 6. That sheet name's already taken. Try a different one. And here's the line that it failed on. Of course, I could name it something different, and then it would go through, and it's going to delete it, so I won't be able to see it anyway. Okay, questions here? So this is a really common thing, is working with and manipulating sheets. You'll find yourself creating sheets through code all the time. Now, the whole reason that we're using this particular example is because there's another collection on here. We've got all these charts. So we've got these charts. So let's kind of work with some of them here for a minute. We're going to have a whole day where we're working with charts, but I just want to kind of, again, we're having the feeling of working with different kinds of objects, your built-in collections. Sub chart demo. So there's a collection called chart objects. So chart objects should be all the charts, all the objects that have charts in them on the sheet. Remember, a chart can be its own kind of sheet. I can have a chart sheet, but I think it's more common usually to have charts put onto a sheet somewhere. And that's what we have here. So how many of them are there here? Looks like there's 9. So that should tell us that there's 9. Oh, I got to tell it what sheet. It doesn't know what sheet I'm talking about. So I'm going to say active sheet. That tells me we've got 9 chart sheets on here. Incidentally, those are also, each one of those charts is in a shape. Let's see, active sheet dot shapes dot count. That should also print 9, because I think the only shapes we have on there are ones that are holding charts. But if I was to put some other kind of shape on here and come to insert, some kind of illustration shape, I'm just going to put like an oval somewhere on this chart. So now that's going to tell me that I've got 10 shapes, but because that one does not have a chart in it, it's not a chart object. And so I should still have just 9 chart objects here. So one collection is all the shapes, whether they have charts or not. Other one is just the shapes that have charts in them. Well, I could take that the very first one here, and we refer to the very first, we'll do it as a shape, should be the first shape that was put onto this sheet. I'll refer to one of these. How do you think I'm going to refer to a particular one of these shapes? Instead of dot count, what am I going to put here to refer to the first shape? Yeah, in parentheses, I'll just put 1. And instead of printing it, why don't I do this? I'm going to change a property of it. I'm going to change the top property of that. I'm going to make it equal to current top property. Why don't we say -5? And so when I run this, it should, maybe that's not the first one. No, actually, so the question is, would it be in position 0? And the answer is collections in VBA begin counting at 1. There is no position 0. So let me look at shapes.1 and ask what the top is. That should tell me some number as to where it is. It's 600 somethings in. So maybe instead of moving it by 5, I'll move it by 50. And maybe we'll be able to see it. Oh yeah, we can see it move now. So if I add on to, can you see it happening? So what is that? That's number 1. What does that mean? That means that was the first one that was created. So I can refer to these individual ones. Once I've referred to an object in a collection, I can play around with the properties and methods that might belong to that particular object. Okay, so those are like shapes and chart objects. By the way, I think I can probably refer to that by its chart object position as well. So instead of shapes 1, I think that will actually, I think that the chart objects have a top as well. I'm not positive, this may be an error. Yeah, so the chart object also has a property, has the top property that I can manipulate the same way. Any other objects you want to see about? I have a whole day where we talk about ranges, a whole day where we talk about manipulating chart objects. What other kind of object might be helpful to learn about just as we're dealing with objects? I can't think of any. Uncharacteristically, I'm done talking before the time says it's time for us to go. No doubt I will be holding you over by 1 or 2 minutes several times through the semester. So why don't we call it good? One more question, then we'll call it good. Yeah, our pivot tables objects. Yeah, can we change those through code? Yeah, we can change every little part of a pivot table that we want through code. We've got a day to dealing with pivot tables as well. I'm glad to know you're excited about that. Excellent. All right, thanks for coming, folks. Thanks for coming. Remember, no class Monday. A week from Wednesday is optional, and we're going to be doing stuff that's not even VBA. So if you're interested, come. If you're not, don't feel obligated. No attendance on that. Oh, we don't do attendance anyway. All right, thanks for coming. Bye-bye.